I'm Justin, and alongside me is Taryn. We're curious about the intersection of design in the evolving landscape of AI, how AI is reshaping design and transforming our professional landscape. What happens when a designer with coding background starts using AI not just as a tool, but as a thinking partner, prototyping engine, and a creative collaborator all at once? Today, we're talking to Idam, product designer, and someone who's generally reimagining what it means to design and build in the age of AI. Idam uses Claude Code, Codex agents, and a stack built around React and component libraries to generate prototypes at pace most teams can't match. But here's what we really loved about the conversation. He's not just going fast. He's thought deeply about when to slow down, when to step back, and when to recalibrate. This episode is for anyone who's ever wondered what it actually looks like to work with AI in a rigorous, creative, and deeply intentional way. Let's dive in, shall we?
Welcome to Designing for Humans in the Loop.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And talk to us a little about your journey in design and where you are today. I think you're at UpGuard, is that correct?
Yep, that's right. So I'm a product designer, spent the last 10 or so years working for different B2B software companies. So currently at UpGuard, working on something new. But as for my sort of professional background, like you were saying in the intro, I've also been coding on the side for a while now, never for work, but for personal projects. But it's been quite interesting in the last, 18 to 24 months. Those two worlds have merged. So I'm not in Figma as much anymore. I'm using coding agents very heavily in my day job, in my design work. And on the side, I'm building tools to help other designers get better use out of them.
Do you feel like it's the moment for people like yourself who used to code as a child and always
Yeah, it's great.
Now I actually use it in my real day job?
100%. And I think there's something to the fact that it's not just the coding part, but the design side as well, right? Sort of being able to put the two together. It's quite powerful.
Yeah, it definitely would be. We're going to touch on a few things today, but really where I'm excited and where we sort of introduced ourselves on LinkedIn was the idea of you building a small tool to capture how you're moving through all of the prototypes you're building. But talk to us a little bit about your process and how you use AI. Is there a sound process you're moving through, or are you still developing that? I want to talk a little bit about that, what tools you maybe use, what your stack look like, maybe some tips and tricks for the audience.
100%. So the first thing I'd say, this is fresh as of this week, but I am a very heavy user of like the Claude Code and Codex agents. I'll sort of swap between the two. But my process looks something like I don't actually start, I don't start with something like make me X screen and then sort of looking at that. It's more so spend maybe a good 10 minutes just having the model interview me. What is my intent? What is the thing that I'm trying to do? What do you want this to feel like? What do you want this to not feel like? And sort of having like that rich context that the model can actually use so that I'm not spending more time later defining what that looks like. As for my stack, just using things like React. I've got using some component libraries that have already been set up for me. But those are just, basic front-end stuff. But it's a lot about getting that intent right so that I don't have to babysit it as much later is sort of what I'm trying to go with.
Yeah, so it's a lot of planning, really refine that plan up front to ensure that things have got a good rigor process around them as you're sort of starting to, I suppose, run it.
I'm trying to move towards a world, and so I'm working on a command line program that your agent can use to sort of bootstrap that. But the idea is if I can give it as much context, I can sort of let it do its thing while I'm maybe focusing on other things so that I can actually have a little bit more of that hands-free moment that the engineers have. And I've been sort of mad that the designers haven't gotten that just yet.
One of the things that Taryn and I kicked off with this podcast and we debated was a year or so ago now, was the idea that a button will lose a designer's job. But you touched on something just then that was really interesting, is that I allowed the agent to go off and do what it needed to do, and I could do some different tasks, some higher level thinking. Does that Is that right in that sentiment of what I just said? Because I think that that's true. I think we can, as designers, level ourselves up to more strategic thinking without having to do the rudimentary stuff that we probably spend a lot of time doing, or think that that's our value, I suppose.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, again, like, I'm not tied to an exact way because everything changes every 2 weeks in this world. But I would agree, yes, like the execution work doesn't seem as it should take as much time, where you should really be thinking. I mean, it's always a designer questions like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? What is the like bigger frame of this? And I guess training those skills is, you do have more room for that for sure.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I think. So, talk to us a little bit about then. Are you the only designer on your team working like this, or have you been able to sort of? Because I think it's a new role that you've just walked into. Have you been able to have a team that you're working alongside, working in similar ways, or you've come in and being able to go, like, this is how we're going to start to work, and it's going to starting to sort of set some good design practices, I suppose, around, or rigor around how you use and leverage AI in the design process?
So I am like 4 weeks into this job, so I'm still sort of settling in, but I've been like pleasantly surprised because there's already a core sort of toolkit that other designers have actually already set up. Like, it was really good because I was able to come in and sort of get started with the kit there. So to be clear, there's about, I think, 8 designers?
Yep.
9 designers? I need to count. But yes, about 9 designers in the team. And they've already sort of got a toolkit that I can sort of come in and say, I'd like to create some prototypes in the style of the company. And sort of having that pre-made just meant that I was able to sort of get going with the conventions that were already set. So it's been great.
Yeah. And how does that work? Do you all work out of, there's lots of talk to go, someone prefers this way of working in terms of the large language model. Is there a preferred way there, or is it just, whatever works for each designer and they've got their own little way to get the best out of how they approach using a large language model in the design process?
Specifically, I think, both of the companies that I've been sort of using this stuff in, it's been a Claude shop. So it's been Claude Code has been the tool of choice. And then that just sort of works with a common repository that you can sort of get through GitHub.
How does it unlock creativity, I suppose, when we start to look at some of the, you've got your rigor in terms of your design practice now. How does it unlock more creativity for you and the team in terms of the work you do?
So for myself, I think it's actually quite interesting because I think in the right settings, it can reduce creativity because you may be just looking at the same output. So something that I'm really quite interested in is, I guess, the base level is like, how do I generate as many variations as possible as quickly as I can, right? And I want to compare them because I think that's the sort of the mode where I find myself applying the most sort of judgment to, why do I prefer this over that? Why is this solution better than this one? And sort of being able to put myself in a position where I can sort of engage that part of my thinking sooner, I think has been the most important thing in terms of, and I think that leads me to, again, think deeper, think more critically, really sort of get a feeling for what that decision looks like. And I think that's the way that it's unlocking creativity. But if you don't do it, it's very easy to look at the one thing. And I think that's where you can sort of get stuck into a bit of a trap creatively as well.
Yeah. And that leads into something around design critique for me. How do you approach that with being able to get as many out as possible in terms of creative variations? How do you take that next approach to critique? And how many people do you maybe involve in that? Because I'd imagine that it'd be a case to say, step back, take your time on what you're seeing here, because sometimes that next decision may put you down into a rabbit hole that you probably don't want to go down too far. Mm-hmm. But also, how do you really think about design critique? Does it change now in terms of that aspect?
I think it doesn't change in that, you still want to present. If you're taking something to critique, you still should be sort of presenting a considered view. Like a designer's point of view should be to consider and edit. So maybe you take your top 3 options or something like that. Where it, I guess, does change is instead of presenting a static screen like we used to, you can sort of present a more clickable, a more like a live version of what you're presenting. So maybe you can get a feel for a better experience. I think that's probably the biggest way that things have changed.
And how have others found that in terms of how you present it? How are they presented in a way around specific journeys, or do you just allow someone to come in that is relevant to your target type, archetype, and just let them go free, given that the content is pretty close to what it might be in terms of synthetic data, of course. But yeah, how has that shaped how you test that then now, maybe?
Yep. I mean, the best example of that for me has been in user testing. I don't have to ask someone to imagine that they're in this scenario and imagine if they click this and imagine if they click that. Like you're right, I can go to the person who would use the software in a user testing session. I can just say, can you just try and do the thing that this is aimed to do? And it's a much more natural sort of observation of how someone might be using a piece of software. And I think the signal that you get from that is quite rich and helpful for that iteration process.
Creating these prototypes, which are pretty realistic, as close to a use case that you wanted, helps with your user testing, usability testing. In terms of the business and stakeholders responding to these prototypes, how have you found that response? Is it, do they expect you to spit out a lot more quicker, faster, sooner? Are they more critical? Has it been more positive because they can actually see it come to life and actually visualize it? Because I think one of our superpowers as designers is we have that ability to think and to visualize and bring things to life in our minds before they actually are brought to life in any medium. So yeah, curious to understand how it's landed with your stakeholders.
Yes, 100%. You can have more productive stakeholder discussions because maybe, again, if we go back to that rapid iteration thing, you can just produce more, right? So maybe you can actually produce version A, version B, version C, and sort of have a richer discussion as to what the outcome of what that, what they were looking for, and sort of have that discussion. The second one that's even more interesting is it's no longer designers now that can do that. So for example, your product managers, your engineers could always do it, but the product managers, for example, can actually come to you with the prototype as well. And that sort of allows for a richer dialogue between the two of you, because instead of maybe sitting in the abstract, you can sort of get a lot more concrete and have a discussion as to what that looks like.
I guess the other part of this is as well, how do you know where to stop? Because you can go on endlessly and you can produce a lot, and it can be unsustainable as well because you're spending all this time and you're exploring all these different options. So how do you know when is enough enough?
I think the jury's out on that one. It's if you've ever vibe coded, we all know you stay up a little bit too much. It's really, people do liken it to a slot machine, right? In the sense that you type in a prompt, you'll get something out, and sort of that can be quite addictive. I think it is to just have a bit of discipline around knowing when to stop. But again, I don't know if I have the best answer to that right now.
Yeah, but I think you do, don't you? Because I think what you said earlier, you plan quite rigorously, right? So by planning quite rigorously around what you're trying to achieve as an outcome around the requirement or the need, we should be able to, as designers, and using our critical thinking and really understanding what our customer needs and maybe business needs, we should know where to stop, I'd imagine. That's
a good point. I think, yes, I can sort of get a feeling for when something is feeling right, but maybe the thing that I'm alluding to is the fact that, I don't know, good design is never done, right? You're like, I could make that thing a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. But yes, there is a broad sort of understanding of, okay, this is feeling right. Yeah. But where I sort of find is what if that thing could be a little bit better? Capturing feedback on all these prototypes. And where does that sit for you? Does that sit in a repository or as a database, or have you been able to create some sort of process to be able to leverage AI to, capturing insights across some of the feedback from all the sort of the prototypes that you would test? Yeah, I think for me it hasn't changed too much just yet. I think, the traditional ways of gathering feedback, capture, good note taking is still very important, sort of keeping all of that is important. Where it maybe is, where I'm sort of it does help is in the analysis of large volumes of information. But again, I'm quite I hope so. I hope I'm quite intentional about how I use it, right? The balance that I'm always trying to fit with large scale analysis is does this help me sort of understand things sooner rather than doing the analysis for me. So I guess things like, structured summarization is quite helpful for me. Like I think we were talking a little earlier about skills and sort of how to do that. So for example, I want to get my research summarized in a way, but I might want to do that analysis still myself because I want to get immersed in the world and sort of get that understanding of thinking. So it's a balancing act for me, I think, at the moment as to how I do that. But I could also possibly be exploring more there, but there's so much to explore as well.
Yeah. Good point, though, mate. We can go fast, but it does give us more opportunity to slow down in places where we need to. Because, we know that you do research and sometimes it gets squeezed quite badly. So you don't feel like you can spend as much time synthesizing some of the data. But if we can move quicker in other areas with AI, then does that give us that opportunity to go, I can stop here for a little bit longer and really digest in what I've heard?
100%. I think, yeah, and it's about creating those moments for yourself is the thing that I think really is what I find the most helpful.
Creating those moments. Can you unpack that a little bit for me? What do you mean by that?
I think it's about like, just think about this for a bit. I think, again, it's about surfacing those options and sort of putting in a position where you can review and sort of consider your data, consider all the different options, and again, just making, like, it can be, for example, I like Miro, right? Being able to lay it all out and just sort of sit and look at it for a bit. Again, we're all very focused on speed, which I think is great. But again, it's like having those mode switches in mind.
So where you're consciously stepping back, looking at what you're doing, recalibrating, resetting,
yes,
just by yourself?
Yeah. For now, yes, I think. I think that for now it is very much I think AI, unfortunately, is a bit of a single player activity at the moment. Like, hopefully it gets better, and you can sort of like collaborate with more people over time. But
do you ever see a future, Idam, where you're actually having a meeting with all your agents and you're giving them feedback and they're all in the meeting and they're executing on your design art?
That's really interesting. I guess so. I think I wouldn't probably be talking to the agents, but I would be looking at the work that they produce, like the output of what they are. And again, like making judgments on that, at least from a design perspective.
It's interesting to touch on that, isn't it? The multiplayer experience, as we call it now, isn't it? That it is a very singular experience to, I kind of like to be in a silent space now. I don't really type anymore. I actually prefer to just hit my function button and away I go and I talk to it. I just feel like get into better flow. But it does become that singular experience, doesn't it? But I suppose then that sets ourselves up to go, how do we set up a more of a collaborative experience to what we're learning and what our outcomes are from our learnings and how we've planned and what we're maybe working on together.
I think what I'm hearing you say as well is just because you can go fast with AI, that doesn't mean you go fast. You've got to make time to think, to check in, get your critical thinking right. Yeah.
100%. I think, yeah. There's been a couple of studies now that have freaked me out about it. And the first one is, I think there's one about like your brain on ChatGPT. I think that was the one that sort of, have you heard about that before? I think it's a while ago, but basically talking about the fact that the people who write essays fully with ChatGPT, like their neurons just aren't activating, like their brain, like there's less brain activity when you do fully surrender.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit about building a design repository. For you, I think it was around building some capability. Do you want to talk us a little bit about how you considered to set that up? What were some of the sort of the founding pillars to ensure that there was success there? And then who was the sort of the ultimate end users of this design repository? And I suppose maybe set the tone is that it's really around a repository for sort of a lot of prototyping that you were doing at the time, right?
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, so I think it was around maybe 18 months ago. I was starting to, it was when agent decoding was kicking off. I had some of access to some of the tools, and I noticed I was making a lot of different prototypes. And, we have Figma sort of where you can put different design files, but I noticed that I didn't have a place to put all of these coded prototypes. So then I thought, well, I should probably put this in a folder of some sort, which led me to create a Git repository. And then I put it up on the company sort of GitHub account. And then I was sort of thinking, well, actually, all designers could probably just contribute their code to it as well. And so that was the sort of initial way that I guess the repository started, was a place to collect all of your prototypes in a single place. Similar to, I guess, how you would have a Figma organization is the best way that I can frame it. The second part was around, I think we've all sort of known by now, but agentic coding is going to take over the world. So I was sort of really thinking about how do we get other people sort of involved? How do people get started? How do designers actually start to play around with this? So the work that I did was to create the repository so that people didn't have to deal with things like, how do you set up your own dev environment? How do you learn how to use Git? How do you sort of get started with these things? So I made a bunch of skills so someone could just download it and then set it up. And then I had a bunch of Claude skills to make it easy to sort of set up and spin up. And then so that onboarding was a little bit smoother than maybe it otherwise might have been. The third thing around it that was the more fun part was that each designer got their own homepage, sort of like in the MySpace era, how you could have your own customized homepage. And so that was like a low stakes activity to sort of get a feeling for how you might use these tools. Some people, put a little music widgets. Someone built Farmville. That was really fun. And so it was like a good low stakes way to get a feel for how these tools work. So that's a little bit about what that sandbox did.
And what were some of the challenges setting up? Was it getting designers more comfortable with GitHub and all this, or is it more around, was it worth actually setting up in the first place?
I think the adoption, for example, I think it got people to sort of try it, but I think it was still quite difficult. There is a lot of things that you have to learn. You have to learn how to use Git. You have to learn how to submit a pull request. How do you spin up a dev server? So there was still a lot of cognitive load associated with that. I did, it was working quite well for a bit, but then Figma Mate came in and made it really easy. So people started migrating towards that. But yes, there is still a bit of difficulty in how you understand how these systems work. I personally think it's worth making the effort to learn it. And I think it's quite easy to do so. You just ask your little coding agent, but there is still that layer of technical knowledge that you need.
And what about more broadly on the product and maybe engineering folks side, and even broader to that? Did they see benefit of something such a repository like that design they could go to and see what design had been working on, or being able to sort of review those in their own time?
Yeah, I think specifically my product manager and I was swapping prototypes, and that was really fun.
Yeah. So you were stealing from each other?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I'd be like, I like this idea. And then so I could sort of incorporate, we sort of could, have our sessions and conversations, but also exchange prototypes.
I'm just curious, so with your prototypes, how do you work with engineering? Are they just deploying your prototypes with a few changes, or are they, how does it work?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, because I think I have a lot of respect for the engineering peers in the sense that what we do in prototypes is to express the interface. Yeah. Not necessarily for the whole stack. I know people are sort of experimenting with it now, but I do think there is a bit of, you still have to know how code works in order to deliver stuff to customers. I don't know, maybe the models are really good at it now and maybe it's fine, but there were more so really rich expressions of an idea. And then maybe you could take specific parts of the code base and sort of swap it around. But at the time, there were very much two separate things. Engineers could draw on what was happening, but we weren't necessarily at a place where we were a designer would go ahead and ship things that would go and serve to users. But I do know that is starting to happen.
Yeah. And we interviewed Freya late last year, and she actually deploys directly in her company. So that's pretty cool. And I think maybe that's the future as well, eventually. Yeah.
I think we're leading there. I think, it's an interesting question to me on whether, you are doing this to learn and explore, or you're doing it to ship. And I do think they are very different modes, possibly, but maybe all roads go there.
Yeah.
But do they come together at some point, the idea of shipping, but as opposed to maybe learning and exploring?
Probably. I mean, if you can ship faster and if you maybe enable to do it safely, maybe you can.
Yeah.
I recall you said to me previously when we chatted that you started coding pretty young, Idam, and
Yep.
you mentioned maybe the last year or 18 months you've moved to Codex and Anthropic and you're using coding agents. So what else is in your toolkit? And you don't use Figma anymore. So what else is in your toolkit? Because I'm trying to work out, like, you're a designer, obviously thinks deeply, and you do your user research, your testing, but I'm trying to figure out what else is in your toolkit apart from the coding agents, like how, because it feels like the mental model of a designer is changing. Like, what is a designer and who is a designer and what tools do you use to actually do design and produce design? It feels like it's all shifting.
Yep. I think Figma still has a place for that detailed thinking. Like, sometimes I think for me, I think when I'm maybe broadly exploring mid-conceptual spaces, I find it useful to use a coding agent to go from like, here is a rough idea to like, here is maybe a version of it. I think Figma still has its place because you probably don't want to be spending tokens to say, please make this border pixel radius like 8 pixels to 6 pixels. That's probably still maybe better in Figma. So I think my toolkit is probably more so the coding agents are where sort of I shape the idea and sort of really shape what I think the solution might be, and then maybe move to a more traditional design tool for that refinement.
Yeah, I've heard something similar to it with I had a conversation with another designer at was, and I always looked at, well, not I, but probably we always looked at Figma designs as outputs, meaning, oh, here, look, the finished design is done. But when I'd spoken to this designer, it turned it to actually, no, design becomes the input. Because we were talking about how loose sometimes models are that don't give them a gap. They'll open it to a mile wide. They'll just make their own inferred ideas if you're not sort of very clear on your intent. And he was really providing a real clear idea and example to go, no, use Figma and your pixel base to really nail that down as your clear Bible to input to the model, and then you will have a direction. I thought it was a really interesting insight that I went, yeah, that's exactly right. And to your point, you can't just come and go, yeah, just change that to 4 pixels, change that to 5 pixel spacing. It's just such a waste of tokens, right, as you say.
It is an interesting point though, right? And I think it goes to how to use them, because sometimes that the models running off and doing their own thing can be useful in maybe that exploration of an idea. But then you're right, like it's that question of like, how do you steer it to get what you want and not what the model thinks it should do?
Yeah, exactly. Can you, we're talking about the repository, once we come back, can you give us a bit of an example of how that repository played a part in a project? And I'm thinking on the lines of, someone wanted to set one up or a designer wanted to set one up. How would they use it in a project sense?
Yeah. So the easiest way to think about it, I actually think the Figma team space is probably the best way to think about it. So the great thing about all of this stuff is it's just a folder. So imagine if you had a folder of all of your design prototypes. So then you would have, your project A, project B, project C, and they would all just be different prototypes. And so you would have little subfolders in there that you could have an end-to-end experience in. So it would just be more around, and again, I would probably just talk to a model and say, hey, I have this idea. How would I set it up? And the great thing is the model should sort of be able to set it up for you as well. But and then sort of deciding things like, what sort of front-end frameworks do you use? It's helpful to understand and talk to your engineers and go, hey, what do we use at work? Do we use Next.js? Do we use Vite? Do we use something else? And sort of using some of that company information to make it be more closer to what your engineers might experience. Obviously, it's not going to be the full experience, but that way you can have a little bit more similarity in the two types of experiences that you're doing. But yeah, I would just get that information, load up one of the coding agents and say, I have this idea. Can you help me set it up? And it should just be able to go from there.
I think what I'm hearing here is collaboration. Design, don't go off and do your own thing. Think about what others and how you're going to work with them in the project. and you're coming from the engineering, but even product side, it's about collaboration, isn't it, really? What you sort of articulate, and of course, use the model to help you.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think you still got to talk to people and figure out and I think that was actually the more important part. So actually, because it's all folders, another way that you can have it is like each person can have their folder. So I have an Idam folder, we can have a Justin folder, a Taryn folder, but we can still share the same space in that we can sort of share prototypes, but still have a common place for sort of putting them in.
Dom, I'm really curious. You've started at UpGuard. You're using a lot of AI in your design workflow. Previously at Culture Amp, you did the same. You used a lot of AI in your design workflow. Just for companies nowadays, curious, what are companies looking for in designers, and what kind of skill set and capability are they looking for when they're hiring designers?
I think the most interesting example of that I've seen, I think this is again changing, but the most extreme version of this is the compression of a role. So something like, I've seen the term AI builder used a lot, where the idea is that, it's more that you have the capability of having a vague product idea or something like that, and I guess taking it to an executed form. So all of the bits that are involved in the middle, right? In the sense that how to, again, I do think it's important that you know how to work with the technology, because it does really help, because you can get stuck in loops otherwise. But it's more like you sort of take an idea that you have and get a finished product out of it, and it's sort of possible for you to execute that end to end in a high quality way, right? So it's a more broad answer, because I think the skills are broader. But I think if you were to be specific, it would be about you use a coding agent to actually take you from end to end.
So like a Claude Code or a Codex agent to take you.
I think so. Yes. Yeah. Something like that. I think, yeah. I think there's also GitHub Copilot, but there's a lot of them, but Claude Code and Codex are the sort of two most common ones.
Yeah. And if we break that down a little, like one level below, what are the specific skills that companies are looking for?
It's a good question. Because when I was sort of interviewing, I think people are sort of still in a bit of an exploratory phase. I think it is more so, do you have experience with front-end frameworks? Do you sort of at least understand the semblance of what that code is like? And so, do you still know how to design well, but then do you have that foundational understanding of just how these things work so that you can take it end to end?
And you mentioned skills the last time we chatted, like where designers can actually upskill. I think you mentioned React and GitHub.
Yes, 100%. I think React is probably the big one, because a lot of interfaces, and again, this is where you might want to talk to engineers, but a lot of front-end interfaces are done in React, and I think it can be helpful to just know the fundamentals of it. And then Git, I think, is my number one probably thing to learn, because it is the thing that enables you to iterate and checkpoint versions over time.
I think they're ones that designers will be asking themselves, well, how do I set myself up for success for this, and what do I need to develop or learn? And I think what we've learned over our period of time of interviewing people such as yourself, Idam, is that it's not, I'll go and watch a video for an hour and think you've learned something. It's actually just going and building.
Yes, 100%.
Being more curious than you've ever been. So I want to move through to a little bit around design thinking and what does that mean in this AI world. You personally touched on before that it's more important than ever to hold your critical thinking skills over AI. But how do you hold that muscle? How do you keep it going? How do you keep practicing it, given that you could sort of, I'll just let AI to do it?
I think the first thing is, just keeping it in mind is the first thing. It's probably one of the most front of mind things for me when I'm sort of viewing it is am I just letting it rip? Am I thinking? Am I sort of evaluating critically? The second point is, I guess, I'm building little tools and Claude skills. I'm building little tools for myself to make it easier to compare different versions. So it's quite important to me that I don't it's the same with your Figma. If a designer came to me and said, here is the thing I've designed, and there's only one version of it, it would be did you explore any other variations? Did you sort of think about X, Y, and Z dimensions? And so what I'm trying to do with my, I guess, agent-driven design process is to surface those iterations in an easy way as well. So can I say, I have version A, version B? Can I compare them really well? Can I see what works in one, works in the other? And then so that really helps in that creative process where I'm able to actually articulate for myself, this worked well, this didn't work well. And so I have that expression of how this idea evolved.
Yeah. Can I dive in onto the skills there? Because I think that's a really good one, actually, is where do you identify that skill, or where do you identify that little application that could be valuable to you? And that is then, does that become something you look at and repeat and go, actually, that is actually a good thing to actually replicate and build?
Yes, I think, the first thing is like, as with all sort of good design, I sort of realized that there was a problem where you can have a version and then you just see the newest version all the time. And I'm like, well, that's not quite right, because I actually wanted to see what I did in the past and I didn't want to have it override my thinking. And then so you're right. Like I was like, okay, well, again, this is a really good thing with these tools. I just sort of worked with the model and said, hey, I've got this idea for this issue I have. Can you help me figure out a plan on how we can maybe solve it, to actually build the tools? Noticing problems as I go to sort of, again, elevate my thinking, understand how I go, and sort of building surfaces for myself to help bring that to the forefront.
Yeah, nice. Moving through to a little bit more traditional process and design, maybe working in Miro on a wall, how do you connect both of those processes and flows to, traditional design thinking, in a workshop sense? And then how do you transition that into AI? And does that change in any way?
I mean, I feel like the good thing about it is like, in a workshop or in a Miro, you can actually capture a lot of rich context that you can use for your next iteration. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a thing, like I can like have a workshop, you can agree on a thing, and then you can actually just pass that as context and say, hey, I've got all this context that I've developed in this workshop or this Miro. Can we make a prototype out of it? And again, but like, going through the process of planning what that is and still having a conversation with the agent to say, this is sort of what I would like to see. And then that's sort of where the transmission happens. And it can be vice versa as well.
And what does this look like in 6 to 12 months?
Look, I do think my path is that more of this just execution layer work does go away. Maybe the models will, like, the thing though is like, the biggest thing in design that I'm noticing is part of doing good design is the exploration itself. Like, there's this thing around, like, you have an initial brief and, if you give it a model, it'll go ahead and do it. But sometimes you actually want to steer what the brief is, because you actually discover that there's a new question there and you can sort of build on your thinking. You can sort of move things and reframe things and sort of move along with that. And so I maybe what I wonder is if we'll kind of be in that layer a little bit more, where we are actually considering the problem, considering the thing, but then reviewing outputs and things like that. But who knows? Maybe it will get really good at that. Maybe it won't. But that's sort of where my thinking is going.
I'm just thinking about this article I was reading yesterday about the 2028 global intelligence crisis. So this group called Citrini, they pulled together this, I'm not sure if you've read this one, but looking and forecasting what 2028 is going to look like. And run by agents, run by agentic AI. And it's interesting, it's scary.
It's all very uncertain.
When Justin asked you that question, I was like, we actually don't know what it's going to look like in 6 months or 12 months. We literally don't know. And which is why I asked you the question, are you going to one day have your AI agents in a meeting with you? Which I think that could be a reality in the future, yeah?
I think so. I think, I mean, look, the thing that I'm most certain about is if anyone tells you they're certain about it, I don't believe them, because it's just so uncertain.
It's also the case to say that human connection and working alongside each other, whether you're an engineer, a business analyst, designer, product, is more important than ever, and more probably connecting than ever to be able to really sort of dive into sort of, gnarly problems that we could probably never solve because it took too long, or there was never any value or budget there from a business perspective, that now is, I suppose.
Actually, that's a great point. I think, a lot of the discussion these days is about how you can probably do more, as in, so like you can do things with less people, right? Like as in to achieve the same output. But like, I guess the provocation there is like, can you actually do more with the same amount of people? Because you can actually raise your ambition. And that's sort of like, I think, a challenge, right? Because we are used to thinking in the ways that we're thinking now. But yeah, can we think bigger, solve bigger problems?
Yeah. Exciting times. Idam, in terms of where people can find you or things you're working on that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah. So yeah, you can, like, if you want to chat more, like, you can find me on my LinkedIn, but otherwise go check out my website. It's idamadam.com. I've got a couple of skills, I guess, to help make it a bit easier to think through and sort of surface your thinking in design tools. So I'm really welcome feedback on all these things, because I'm trying to, I want to bring more people along, get people more think more thoughtfully with their use of AI tools when designing. So the more things I can do to help that, the better it is.
Oh, that's a great way to finish. Well, thank you for spending the time with us today. It's been brilliant, so thank you.
Thank you.